we don't really grasp how often and how widespread in the ancient world people were to not surviving. You're really just one crop away from not having enough food and literally starving to death. Hello and welcome to Reasoning Through the Bible. My name's Glenn and this is Steve. And we are going to do a topical study today on the issue of slavery and the Bible. And if you're just here for these topical ones, we encourage you to watch and listen to our normal verse-by-verse Bible study, where we do very careful verse-by-verse studies through the Word of God. And today, though, in our study, we've gotten to Exodus chapter 21, and that talks about slavery. So that gives us a chance to slow down just a bit and deal with it, because there are many passages in the Bible that do talk about slavery. And because that's such a sensitive issue, then we wanted to be very careful with it and not treat it lightly. And Steve, before we get in, we just want to reassure our listeners that we're not trying to make light of the issue of slavery. It's very serious, it's very painful, and because of it, that's one reason we wanted to be so careful with what we're doing with the Word of God.
Yeah, it is sensitive, and one of the reasons why it's sensitive is that because it's a part of our recent history, and recent I'm saying in the last 200 or 300 years, and it was definitely a system and a way that it was used where people were kidnapped, bought and sold and traded from across the globe in various different areas. And we're going to put into context regarding what was going on at the time, what is actually said here in relation to it. But no, in no way, shape, form, or fashion are we justifying slavery or anything else like that. We're just putting it into context in regards to what's going on as we go through Exodus here, because it's the giving of the law, and this happens to be one of the first things past the 10 Commandments that is dealt with.
Right. And so before we really just jump in with both feet into the passages, I just wanted to take a brief moment and give two things. First of all, just a summary of all of what we're doing, because this will take a while. We're assuming it's going to take more than one session here. And so we're going to go into these things at great length. And so just a quick summary so that you'll know kind of where we're going with this. The Bible does indeed talk about slavery, and we're going to deal with all of the passages that deal with that, at least the ones that tend to come up. Much of what we're doing today is not just explaining the text, but because there's such a sensitivity, and rightfully so, there's a lot of pain involved in slavery, and in modern mind, it's especially acute. And so what we want to do is deal with that, but also add some historical context, because what many of our friends in the skeptic, atheist, and critical community will take a verse, a passage, and make it look like that's the entire Mosaic Law dealing with that one verse or that one passage. And really nothing could be further from the truth. The Mosaic Law is all of Leviticus, all of Deuteronomy, part of Numbers, and part of Exodus. And so there's a lot there, and you really have to take it as a whole. And because it's long and somewhat tedious, many people just don't take the time to balance these things. What you can't do is take a verse, a passage that, yes, that one verse may say that, but you have to compare that to the rest of the Mosaic Law. So that's what we're going to try to do here today. And we're also going to talk about, in Hebrew, the word that is often translated slave or bondslave or servant. The Hebrew language has fewer words in it than the English language. And because of that, English has a lot more words to nuance meaning. The word there that is used for slavery is used about 800 times in the Old Testament. And the vast majority of the time, that word is not talking about chattel slavery, just owning people. Sometimes it is, and we'll go through those passages. Sometimes it does talk about owning people, and we're going to deal with that. There's a reason for it, and it's not always the reason why people think today. Most of the time when the word's used, it's talking about just servants. It's just talking about servants. So we have to look at the passages and distinguish between the times when it talks about a servant and the time when it talks about a slave. And what does it really mean there? Most of the time, it's not talking about people being, like we think of slavery, people being kidnapped against their will and forced into long, hard labor and put under abuse. There's systems in place in the Mosaic Law to prevent all of that type of slavery. Our skeptical and critical friends, the nicest thing we could say is a half-truth. It's a half-truth because simply and a half-truth is a lie, because when you look at the fuller picture, the picture of slavery in the Mosaic Law is not what the average person today thinks of. Wouldn't you agree, Steve?
Yes, and to your point, there's other parts of the law itself that are against what we're going to look at here, and we're going to go through some of those as well. So you got to look at all the law together as one part, and where somebody might take a particular one and try and make a case out of it in regards to this is not morally right. There's other parts of the law that actually would prohibit it. The person would be guilty of violating the law or going against the law and be guilty of that because of these other areas and other sections. So it's not just as black and white as the skeptics and the scoffers want to make out.
So we will spend enough time to go through all the passages. We're going to hit it right between the eyes. We're not going to dodge or weave. We're going to deal with the issue because that's what's before us. The reason I care so much and get a little bit emotional about this is simply because I have a lot of high value for the Word of God, and I think it prevents, or at least it presents a great deal of ethical treatment of all kinds of people. And now we have modern day critics taking a painful issue, which is slavery, coming out of modern day slavery, and they're taking that pain and they're picking places out of the Bible and using that as an intentional tool to try to draw people out of the church or draw people away from Christianity and Judaism, when really, again, if you look at what the Bible's saying, it's something very different. And so we're not going to dodge or weave. We'll deal with all the passages, but just a quick summary before, because this will be a little bit long. It's always a lot easier to throw out an accusation than it is to explain the context around it. Just a quick summary, and then we'll go in later and deal with these things in more detail. Yes, there's passages such as Leviticus chapter 25, verses 44 to 46, that talks about owning people and passing them down, inheriting them as property to your children. There's a reason for that, and we'll explain what that reason is, and it's often very different than what the modern people think. It's not for chattel slavery. That was prevented. It deals with Canaanites that were, remember, the entirety of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy were just before Israel moved into the Promised Land, and the Canaanites were there. These were people that were frying their children in the heated arms of a metal idol. Those were the people that God says, go in there and wipe them all out. Destroy every last one of them. Because God had sent them prophets and they refused to repent. And so God says, I'm judging them because they refused to repent. And so therefore, God knew Israel would not destroy all those people. So he says, okay, you can keep some of them as possessions. But these are prisoners of war. These are people that, if you let them go, are going to go right back to, you had been at war with them. They'd sneak up behind you and slit your throat. I mean, these were people they were trying to kill you, and you were trying to kill them, and they're prisoners of war. Those were the people that were owned, if you will. And so we'll get into more detail on that. There's oftentimes the modern skeptics view these things through this lens of modern slavery, when the Mosaic Law had laws in it to prevent all kinds of abuse. You could not abuse anyone, even down to bruises were prevented. And so we're going to deal with that. That's really the answer to all of this. The Bible, and again, the Mosaic Law has commands in it to treat all people the same, slave or free, foreigners, citizens. You had to treat everyone the same, down to every kind of injury and things like that. And so we'll deal with these passages that the skeptics tend to throw up and make it sound like that's not the case. With that, Steve, any comments before we just sort of jump in?
Nope, I think we need to go.
Okay, so in Hebrew, and we'll give some numbers here for like for example, the term in Hebrew ebed is the Hebrew word. There's a lexicon called Strong's lexicon. It's Strong's number 5650. We'll throw a few of those words out so people can go to many of the lexicons and really look up the terms for themselves. Brown Driver Briggs is probably the standard Hebrew lexicon. But if the word ebed in Hebrew appears 800 times in the Old Testament, most of the time it's talking about a servant. It's talking about a servant, just a regular servant, the vast majority of time. Some of the time it's talking about a bondslave. It's talking about someone who has a bond, who has a contractual arrangement. And a few of the times it's actually talking about owning a slave as far as owning property, right? But you'll see various English translations that use this word as slave. Some of them say servant, some of those bond slave. The term is the same, but you have to look at the context to determine which ones of these type of servants it's talking about. Now, there's a similar word, abad, that means to serve or make oneself a servant. So ebed is one where it's just talking about this servant or this bond slave, but then there's another word where people would actually make themselves. It's talking about the act of making oneself a servant or making oneself an ebed. For example, Jacob, in the story in Genesis chapter 29, Jacob falls in love with this daughter named Leah. And in order to become married, the father says, oh, you have to enter a bond with me. You have to agree in a contractual arrangement to work for 7 years. Mm-hmm. And so this was he was a ebed, he was a servant, he was a bond slave, and it was because of this contractual agreement. And actually he ended up doing it twice because the father-in-law broke the contract, made him do it again.
Right.
But all I'm saying is that this was a voluntary act of the same word for bondslave. And so there were times where people would voluntarily put themselves into these arrangements. And Genesis 29 deals with people voluntarily doing it. Now,
let me interrupt you just a second, because I want to make it clear to our listeners and to our viewers. What you're saying is that the word slave at the time is used in a term that we would modern day say servant. And sometimes it's related to a specific servant, but it's also used in that term. So just as words over years have different meanings, we have words today that we use that 50 years ago meant something completely different. And so they're used in a different context. What you're saying is that when that Hebrew word ebed or abad, you're making the distinction that it might say slave, but we might be termed a servant, a bond servant, somebody that is there where it says might say bond slave, it's bond servant, to where they're in servitude voluntarily or with that person or that family. That's a clarification, right?
I'm saying that plus. I'm saying yes. The word that is translated as servant or slave or bond slave, Hebrew word ebed, is used in many, many passages, at least 800. And it sometimes means just a servant, just somebody that's like the maid or the butler or the hired worker or like a hired worker.
But the text might say slave.
Depending on the translator, they may translate it every single time servant. They may translate it every time slave, depending on the translator's preference, because the term could mean any of these things. And so we have to look at the context of the sentence in the passage and the book to determine, is it talking about a hired servant? Is it talking about a slave that's purchased? Is it talking about a contractual arrangement, like with Jacob and Leah, because these term was used in all these circumstances.
Yeah, and in cases they were used, a slave would be termed or be thought of as a servant. And again, it comes back to us in our recent history. When we hear slave, we automatically come to mind slaves in the 1800s. And so this is something that is thousands of years before. And I'm not trying to make light of it, but I'm just wanted to clarify as you go through here is that when it says slave, many times it's interchangeable with a servant, somebody that's working for the household.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Because what I want to do now is to go through all these various types of ebeds, all these various types of servants or bond slaves, because just exactly what you've said, Steve, we have lost the context. All we know with the word slave is what happened in our recent memory. And the abuses that were done with slave, legitimate, painful abuses, that happened in the ancient world, but not in the Mosaic Law. Because the Mosaic Law was dealing with all these other various types of arrangements, and it's dealing with all of this in various places in the Mosaic Law. It's dealing with various instances of this. And what you said is exactly true. We have lost the context. And so before we just get into dealing with the verses, we have to explain the context. And so I've got 6 or 8 different types of what it means here to be this type of servant or bond slave, because it'll talk about purchasing an ebed, purchasing a servant, purchasing a bond slave. And so what does that mean? And if there's a monetary exchange of things, we tend to think, oh, they've kidnapped them, somebody snuck up behind them, knocked them on the head, and forced them, and they've got a business of slave trading going on here, kidnapping people and selling them for a profit. And that's not what the Mosaic Law is dealing with. The Mosaic Law is dealing with 6 or 8 different types of things. Although that happened in the ancient world, the Mosaic Law prevented it, and we'll deal with that.
Right.
So now let's go through, and again, I've got this is going to take a little bit, but I've got, 6 or 8 different types of instances here where someone would have a monetary arrangement where I've bought a slave, and what that means. And for example, one of them is what we would call debtor's prison. People would go into debt and they would have to settle that debt. And in our world, at least in our day, if I go and borrow something from you and I say I borrow enough money to start a business, then I go start that business. If my business goes bankrupt, then I just go down to the court and declare bankruptcy, and you have to get in line with all the other creditors, and you don't get paid. Because what we've said in modern society is, oh, the creditor, the person loaning the money, has to take an equal or at least a partial responsibility here of the risk. And in the ancient day, what they would say is, no. If someone borrows money, you have to pay it back, because not paying it back is stealing, and declaring bankruptcy to the ancient mind was stealing, because you can't just say, oh, I lost it, or it got spent, or business environment got turned bad, so I went broke. No, you have to pay it back, or else you're stealing money. Stealing money is immoral. Not paying back a loan is immoral. So anytime there was a loan, you knew right up front, you have to put up collateral. And if you put up, like today, if I made a car loan or something, and I put up the car as collateral, if I don't make the payments, somebody's going to come tow my car away because I didn't make the payments. Well, in those days, you knew right up front, if you make a loan arrangement where you've borrowed money, you're putting yourself up for collateral. That's the deal. And they knew that in the beginning, because if you don't, you're stealing, and stealing's immoral.
Yeah, and you use the term debtor's prison. I don't know exactly when debtor's prison came along, whether it was in the 700s, 1200s, whatever it might have been, but that's even a more modern deal. At this particular point, we're talking about 1400 BC,
Yes.
roughly. There was no debtor's prison. So if somebody owed a debt, there wasn't arrangements for them to go off to debtor's prison. That's even hundreds and thousands of years even comes by later. So it helps our listeners kind of put into context. But again, coming into this particular point in time, it's got to be dealt with. And you're saying the mindset that there was, you have a debt and it needs to be taken care of. There is no other arrangement at the time. There's no prison. You're not going to go kill them or anything else like that. And it's got to be dealt with in some way. And this was how it was dealt with.
That was how it was dealt with. And the reason I bring up the modern thing is because we would say, and rightfully so, that it's immoral to own a person and buy and sell. Like, this guy owed me money, I'm going to sell him to you. We would say that's immoral. That's the context we're approaching this from. The ancient mind says, wait a minute, what's immoral is I loaned him money and he didn't pay it back. So he has to come work for me and work off the loan. And not doing so is immoral. And don't take my opinion. 2 Kings 4, verse 1, there's a lady there who she's calling the prophet and says, wait a minute, my husband died and we owed money. And because my husband died, we can't pay this back. It says in 2 Kings 4:1, the creditor is coming to enslave my sons. And she was calling for help from the prophet. Well, the creditor had the right to come and get his money because not doing so was immoral. And so that was the mindset back then. And so again, don't take my opinion. 2 Kings 4:1, the creditor has the right to his money. It will get paid. And this is one of the reasons why over in the New Testament, paying the debt of sin is what Jesus did for us. The debt will get paid. It doesn't just poof, it's gone. The debt of sin will get paid. And you're either going to pay it with your life or somebody else has to pay it for you.
Yeah, and again, in your life, you're referring to servitude. In the example you gave there in 1 Kings, she's saying the creditor is coming to take my son. In order for him to go and work it off in servitude to him, in order to work the debt off. That's what.
Correct.
Correct. It wasn't he's going to come take my son and then sell my son somewhere else in order to get his money back. Correct. It was for the son to work off the debt, which was the way that it was taken care of in that day and age.
Right, exactly. And the father in the story knew very well what the consequences were when he borrowed the money in the first place. He knew the consequences. If I die or if something happens, I go broke, they're going to take me and my family to go work it off because the debt will get paid. And so that's what they're talking about as a bond slave, is there's a bond arrangementship. The closest thing I can think of in a modern mind is today, at least in the United States, if somebody goes and commits, or at least is charged with a crime, and they get arrested by the police, then the police arrest them for the crime and they take them to jail and they appear before a judge, and the judge says, in between now and the trial, you can go free if you promise to pay the bond. And oftentimes people don't have the money, so they go to a bonding company and say, if you guys put up the bond, then I promise, pinky promise, I'm going to show up for court.
Right.
Well, guess what? If you don't show up for court, the bonding company says, we're on the line for the money. And they're going to send a bounty hunter because I own you.
Right.
And okay, you're going to jail because are they owning you? Well, no, but they own your time. And they say you will go to jail. And so that's the closest thing I can think of in the modern time, is that you promised at the time, you had the option not to go hire the bonding company. You could have stayed in jail. Okay.
Right.
But same thing in this situation in 2 Kings 4:1. The man knew the consequences when he borrowed the money, is that if I die or if something happens, I can't pay it back, the creditor is going to come looking for his money. Now, in certain cases, in different ages, they would have actual debtor's prison, and you could go down and buy the debt. You could, if you needed a worker and there was somebody there that was in the debtor's prison, you could go and say, oh, he owes a certain amount. I'm going to pay that to the person that he owes it to, and I'm going to purchase that person. So that was one of the reasons for buying someone. But again, they knew about it in advance when they borrowed the money in the first place. This is not kidnapping. It's a contractual arrangement through loaning money, and people knew up front that the collateral is me. That's what I'm putting up for collateral, is my time and my labor. And when I can't pay it back, they're going to come get me until I pay the loan back. And so we'll get into the Mosaic Law put restrictions on that, of that it had to be 7 years. You could buy someone, but what you're really doing is buying their time because of the debt. And again, this is, don't take my opinion, 1 Corinthians 6, verses 19 and 20. You are not your own. You were bought with a price. 1 Corinthians 7, verses 22 and 23, talking about the salvation in Jesus. He who is called while free is Christ's slave. You were bought with a price. Do not become slaves of men. Okay? Do not become slaves of men. So that one tells us that it's this concept of buying someone is because there's a debt. And he's telling us in 1 Corinthians 7, 22 and 23, you were already paid for by Jesus. Don't go out and become a slave of men. So these people had a choice of whether they wanted to be a slave or not. This wasn't kidnapping. This wasn't buying and selling property. They had a choice. Don't get into an arrangement where you're putting yourself up for collateral to where when you can't pay it back, now you're somebody's slave. That's what he's saying. So that is just one. That's the first of the concepts here. Any comments on that before we get to the next one, Steve?
Yeah, I just want to keep hammering this home is that when you're saying to buy someone, what you're talking about is you're buying their servitude.
Yes.
From them. That's what you're buying. You're buying their, like you put it, they themselves are the collateral, and they're going to have to work that off one way or another, whether it's being a house slave or a maid servant, or whether it's working out in the field or whatever it might be. It's their servitude that you're purchasing for them to then repay whatever the debt is that it might have.
Right. And so that's the first one, is this idea of this debtor that's due. There was another way where there would be this contractual monetary arrangement to own someone, if you will, was what was later called indentured servitude, an indenture. Oftentimes this was like a teenage boy would make an arrangement with a master tradesman to teach them the trade. Oftentimes they would go in when they were 12, 13, 14 years old, work for 6 or 7 years, and by that time, in return for the labor of the teenage boy or girl, they would be taught the trade. So that by the time they're 20, 21 years old, they're a master. By then they've learned the trade, they get let go. And so that was another one where, again, it's a contractual legal arrangement. It wasn't kidnapping, wasn't forced to be done. Voluntarily went into these circumstances. But these contracts were legally binding. You can't just say, I don't want to do this anymore. They were legally binding. In the history of the United States, one of the founding fathers was a man named Benjamin Franklin. He was European, came from England, was an indentured servant. And in his autobiography, he talks about running away from the contract. And he had to run away and hide, because if he would have gotten caught, he would have been thrown in prison for violating the indenture. So was he owned as a person? Well, not in the sense of chattel slavery, but the master had total control over him.
He made a contract.
He made the contract. And so oftentimes the parents would see this as a very positive thing. My son can learn a trade, he can make a good living for himself, and in return he gives 7 years of his time to a master tradesman, and he have a good life for himself. It was oftentimes preferred to get a good one Now, were they all nice guys? No. That's why Benjamin Franklin ran away, is the guy was kind of cruel. But the system didn't cause that. It was that individual master. So we don't think of that today. We don't think of this. Another one that gets brought up, and it occurs in the Bible, is at the point of a marriage, oftentimes there's money that exchanges hands. And there's different cultures and different times talk about a dowry or a bride price. A dowry was typically followed the wife. It's given by the parents to the husband to take care of the wife. And sometimes some cultures had it the other way around. The bride price is the husband's family or the husband would give money to the bride's family. And so I personally look at this and I say he's buying a human being. But the people that at the time says, no, this is just the way it's done.
Right.
This is our culture that says this. And so there's a reason for it. So you'll see in some of these passages that we're going to go through, paying for brides. Well, are they buying a human being? I would say so, but the people at the time say, no, this is to take care of things.
And the cultures at that time were also most often arranged marriages, where the daughters were arranged to be married to other men. That was the culture for thousands of years. And again, looking at it through the lens of our current one, daughters today, they have choices to choose whoever they want to marry for the most part. But that's not the culture at the particular point in time. And in fact, even today in our day and age, there's still, in other cultures, still arranged marriages that are made between families who have sons and daughters, and they make arrangements that the second, third, fourth, fifth son who's going to marry the first, second, third, fourth, or fifth daughter, whatever it might be. And that's the culture today. And there's dowries and monies that are exchanged for that again, between those families related to that.
And oftentimes in those cultures, they feel that's the best way. Who does this child know what's best when it's really the parents that know this long-term success of these things? And so that's just another one. So moving on down the list, voluntary slavery, which is a concept totally lost on the modern mind, is that most people today dealing with this issue of these passages in the Bible have totally lost the concept that people would willingly, happily, voluntarily put themselves into a slave relationship or a bond-slave relationship. That's completely lost on culture. But I guarantee you that if you were in a similar circumstance, you would want to do the same thing as what they did. And it's simply because those of us that have eaten in the last 2 weeks really don't have a concept of what it's like to really be hungry.
Yeah.
Of what it's really like to be faced with, no kidding, starvation. That's why is that it's easy for the Western world in modern times when we're all well fed and we've got options for jobs and if we really get destitute, there's social service programs that can come in and step in and keep you from starving. Well, most of human history didn't have that.
And in today's environment, you have the ability to buy property, and you could, put a small garden out to where you could grow some food, or maybe even some acreage where you could have some food, or take that food and barter it for something else. These people didn't have property. The upper class had the property and owned the property. They didn't own the property themselves. They were totally dependent on the upper class related to it. And so what are you going to do if you're starving and you don't have any ability in order to get food? Well, this was an option for them to go and voluntarily put themselves into servitude for a period of time so that they would be able to live.
And again, if easy to say for us that this is not an issue when we're all well fed and got options for jobs and all these kind of things. So again, don't take my word for it. We're dealing with Bible questions. Let's give Bible answers. Leviticus 25:47 talks about someone becoming poor and selling themselves to a stranger. That's in Leviticus 25:47. Another one over in Genesis chapter 29, Jacob, we mentioned this earlier, voluntarily made himself a bondslave for 7 years out of his love for this wife Leah. In another one, Genesis 47, verse 19, Joseph is a leader in Egypt, and they had stored up food because he knew in advance that there was going to be a famine. And because the famine was so bad, the people had sold all of their property, had sold all of their livestock. They were still hungry. And in Genesis 47:19, the people of Egypt come to the leadership and beg them to buy us as slaves. And I would guarantee you, if you or I were in the same boat, we'd be doing the same things. If the option is, oh, golly gee whiz, I can stay here and starve to death, or I can go over and sell myself to them, then I'll do it, because that way I'll have work, I can get fed, and I'll survive. We don't really grasp how often and how widespread in the ancient world people were to not surviving. You're really just one crop away from not having enough food and literally starving to death. And people oftentimes did not have an option other than, I'm destitute, there's nobody around, I'm going to have to sell myself. And okay, if I have an option, I'll hire myself. But even then, it's a contractual thing that I've agreed to stay here and work for a year. The crop's not going to come in till the fall, and I'm doing all this work in the spring. Okay, I have to hang around and you're feeding me all during this time, and that landowner needs me to help go harvest in the fall. And so if I bug out, you feed me in the spring and then I go leave, the landowner is going to say, wait a minute, you promised, I fed you, I clothed you, I housed you, and you owe me to stay here and work the harvest. And the debt will get paid. Again, we think it's quite moral to give up on debts and just walk out, but they didn't. And so that's another one, is just voluntary slavery out of the well-fed people. Do not have a moral high ground to sit here and tell these people that, oh, no, nobody'd ever really sell themselves into slavery. How dare you? How dare you say that? Another one that's, again, just one of these things, and it occurs in the Bible, prisoners of war. War is an awful thing. Oftentimes soldiers become prisoners of war or considered slaves because what else is going to happen with them? You know, there was a war. They had two armies fighting to kill each other. One of them invaded the other, and they were in a life or death struggle. Some of them get captured. Somebody's going to win. Somebody's going to lose. And so what do you do when the winner has captured other soldiers? What are the logical options? You can kill him. Okay, he just surrendered in the war. Well, I'm gonna put a knife in his throat anyway. Or you can let him live and let him go free. In which case, okay, we've just spent however long fighting each other, trying to kill each other, and I'm going to let him free. He's going to sneak up behind me and kill me and my whole family.
And many times when they would let them go free, if they did, they would maim them. They'd cut their thumbs off, or they'd cut their toes off so they couldn't run, cut their thumbs off so they couldn't grasp swords and other things like that. So that while they might go be free, they'd be maimed.
And so what does the Mosaic Law do? It says you can do, the only other logical option is make them slaves, but then put preventions into where you will not maim them, right, which is what the Mosaic Law does. So you can either slit their throat, that's an option. You can let them go free so they'll sneak up behind you and kill you and your whole family, or you can make them slaves and then put a rule in place that says you cannot abuse them and can't maim them, which is exactly what the Mosaic Law does. Now, another one. Again, it keeps going. Prisoners as bondservants. And the only reason I bring this one up is because it happens sometimes, which is there are cultures that have abused things to the point where they would have, for example, vagrancy laws, right? They make it illegal to be poor. And so there's a vagrant, they're poor, they're sleeping outside. The policeman comes by and says, you're violating the law, we're arresting you. They throw you in prison, and then they farm you out to their buddies to go work at their farm. And really, the technical term for this is a peonage or a peon. If you ever heard the word peon, well, a peon is somebody that through no fault of their own has gotten forced into this forced labor thing, and they're as good as slaves. They might as well be slaves. And the reason why I bring that up is because it's widespread. It happens sometimes of using laws as an excuse to arrest people and then using them as prisoners. My own mother was babysat by a prisoner because my grandfather worked for the prison system. And in those days, they could get prisoners and take them home to work at their house, work on their farm. Or in this case, they babysat my mother when she was a small child, had a convicted prisoner, probably a life sentence guy, that had become a trustee. So people did that. And the reason I bring this up is because our options are going to be, we take people and make them bondservants. Oh, we shouldn't do that. Let's put them in prison for a crime. Well, I'm sorry, my friend. Have you seen the prisons lately? Let's take someone and put them into a small cage, and your cellmate is another insane person, and we're going to leave you there forever. Tell me how that's better than becoming a bondslave to go work, like in my case, babysit my mother. Throwing somebody in prison is equally as bad as putting them under a bond and saying, you've got a choice. You can stay in the prison or you can come work my farm, right? And so that's part of some of these things that go on. Still, children of slaves. There's some of the passages in these things we're going to talk about that talk about children of slaves. If somebody is a bondservant, they owe me money, they're under a bond, they're working for me, what happens if they have a child? What are we going to do? Oh, you can now leave and take the children with you. You owe me money. Again, the bond will get paid. And so the children have to stay here until the bond is over. And so we'll deal with that. And lastly, kidnapping, which is, I put this last because that's the one everybody thinks of, is sneaking up behind somebody, grabbing them against their will, and then taking them down to the slave market and selling them. That was something done in the ancient world, and it's actually prevented. Exodus 21:16, kidnappers were to be put to death. Genesis 37:28, Joseph's brothers violated the law and sold him as they kidnapped him and sold him. But by the time we get to the Mosaic Law, they prevented chattel slavery.
Yeah, it was prohibited, I think is a better word. It was actually outright prohibited very directly. This you shouldn't do.
So all of that is before we get to explaining the Bible passages. And the reason why is because all that people look at it now is, oh, they're owning someone and they're selling them. Well, that is at best a half-truth, simply because who's going to pay the money that you borrowed? And it's in their minds in those days, very similar to, you made a car loan, you put your car up for collateral, you owe me the car. Or you were arrested, I agreed to put up a bond, and now you didn't show up to court, you owe me your time, I'm taking you to jail. So people, as in that 2 Kings 4, they borrowed money knowing up front that if I can't pay this back, then I'm going to have to go work for you to work it off. And that was a bondslave. And so all of the passages that we're going to deal with next time in the Mosaic Law assumes most of them are bondslaves. Most of them are either prisoners of war or somebody that made a contractual arrangement for a specific period of time, and that's a slave. That's a bondslave. So, any other comments, Steve? We didn't get to the passages on this one, but we'll get to it next time.
Yeah, no, I don't have anything else.
Okay, so all of that's really, again, set up for next time. And so again, as we said, it's a lot easier to throw out an accusation than it is to actually explain the context. So we'll get to all the passages next time. Exodus 21 and Leviticus and Numbers and go through those next time. This is how we reason through the Bible, and we trust that you'll be back here with us next time to do so as well.